basically what I want to take you through is the very beginning of the T-Splines 101. You just got it, you're looking at it, you're trying to figure out what all these things mean, and to some extent, when you first sit down and look at T-Splines, it can be a little bit daunting if you're coming from the NURBS world, because it's a completely different way of working. Typically in the NURBS world, I kind of like to explain it. It's like a foam core model paradigm where you're cutting out shapes and you're gluing it together on the edges to pull out a volume. With T-Splines, it's a much more kind of push and pull, kind of stretching clay and mushing things around kind of paradigm. And from somebody coming from a typical NURBS user, if you have a lot of experience in that, it may not make sense to you right off the bat. And I don't want you to get hung up on that, because you will get it. And what I hope to do is show you a couple of different ways to make some really simple objects and let you leave here with a couple of different examples of how you could build something in T-Splines. And then I want to leave you with one kind of concrete, cinder block simple way that you can build a model using just a couple of tools and make stuff. And some of you who have taken the class or seen some of the other webinars, some of this may be a little bit familiar, but I feel fairly strongly that it's a really good way to get a foundation and get started and get you from I just bought the software to now I'm making stuff. So without beating that too much to death, let's talk a little bit about the T-Splines toolbars. And just to back up to the very, very beginning, if you've just installed it and are getting started, if for some reason you don't see these T-Splines buttons here, this T-Spline container, if you go to your tools in your toolbar layout, if the plugin is installed correctly, you should see a T-Splines toolbar collection. If you click on that, you can see all the different sub-toolbars in here, but the one that you want to make sure that's loaded is the container. If we turn that on, you'll see that that pops up and allows you access to the T-Splines tools. You'll also notice up in your menu bar that there's a T-Splines drop-down that also has all of the the T-Splines commands and stuff that you would need to get to. And then if you go under the help, there's the T-Splines options here, which you'll notice if you open your Rhino options, which you can also get from Tools Options. You go to the very bottom here, and there's some T-Splines information about your plugin, what your current release is, whether or not you want to automatically check for updates, some display issues that we're not going to necessarily get into at this point, hotkey setups if you want to do that, and then some options for how Rhino converts to curves and surfaces and stuff like that. Anyway, we're not going to get too much under the hood as far as this stuff is concerned, but I want you to know at least how to find this and where it is. So once the container is loaded, obviously you can dock it, you can move it around, you can do what you want. I typically stick it up here and dock it with my regular toolbars. And then you have two options here, the toolbars, which are a lot smaller, or the toolbars with text, which tend to be a little bit larger, but when you're using it, when you're just learning it, it's nice to know exactly what all these icons mean. Once you get comfortable with the software, chances are you'll either run off of these icons, or you'll actually even just run off the menu picks, or set some hotkeys up and stuff like that so you can work efficiently. So in the tools, we're only going to cover a couple of these because when you're getting started, I don't want to overload you with too much stuff that becomes confusing. The kind of the fundamentals of the T-Splines workspace is the heads-up display, obviously the toolbar, and the drop-down. We've covered the toolbar and the drop-down, so let's look a little bit at the heads-up display. You can access that heads-up display by the translate button up here. If you click on this, it'll bring up the heads-up display. If you right-click on it, it will let's see now. If you click on that, it'll bring it up, and then each one of these different options in here, if you click on these, you'll notice that it changes to a different manipulator. And if I click on an object down here, you'll notice a couple of things happen. First of all, it's highlighted as a curve, and it tells me it's a curve down here. And right now, my manipulator's hidden. If I click on this to translate, you'll notice that I get a triad that allows me to move the curve based on which handle I grab. And it's constrained to whichever plane handle that you grab. So obviously if I grab this one, it's going to go only up and down, only left and right, only in and out. And then I've got these discs in here which allow me to move freely within the up and down plane, otherwise the Z plane. This one allows me to move just around the XY plane. And this one obviously allows me to move around the ZY plane. So between these manipulators, you can move in and out. You can constrain to a plane. You can go over, constrain to a plane. You can also double-click on a manipulator to enter a distance that you want to move. So if I want to move a specific number of units in the Y, I can double-click on this. I can enter my translation distance, which is whatever my Rhino units are. In this case, it's inches. So if I want to move over 3 inches, I just hit 3. My curve moves over. If I double-click on it and I want to move back 3, I do -3, and it moves over. So, and that's in all the translators, that's the same way this works. Obviously, if I want to move here, same thing, enter. If I want to move back, I'm just going to go negative. Okay, so that's the basic foundation behind how the manipulators work. And if I click up here, this one is obviously the translate, which is the one that you would use to move things. This one is the rotate, and by grabbing each one of these particular rings, I can move in the X, Y, or the Z. And again, the same thing, if I want to move a specific distance, I can double-click on this, and I can rotate 10 degrees. If I want to go back, I'm going to rotate -10 degrees. Okay? The next manipulator, if I click up here, is the scale. Same thing. I can scale in one direction. I can constrain my scale to this plane. I can constrain my scale to these planes. Or if I grab in the middle, the whole object goes up and down. Okay, and again, if I want to do a global scale on this, I double-click it. If I want to double the scale, I type a factor of 2, and I can control it that way. The final manipulator is hidden, which hides the manipulators, obviously, by the name, and then I can just click through and get to those. Now, there are hotkeys for these, but for the purpose of this, I'm not going to be using any of them because I don't want you to get lost on the hotkeys. The next thing that you'll notice here, and we'll get into this a little bit more as we start making some geometry, is the mode. And in a T-Splines object, there are, let me just throw a quick one out here. There are objects, which if I pick this, I'm moving the entire object. If I change this mode to verts, you'll notice that points start lighting up, and I can affect this on a point level. If I click it again, it's an edge, and I can affect this on an edge level. And you'll notice that edges have a little less control and actually are a little bit smoother than verts. Verts give you a little control. The next one would be a face. A face is kind of the least amount of control, but is going to make the smoothest transitions. And then the final mode, of course, would be object. Come on. There we go. Would be the object in which I can grab the entire piece. So kind of your first line of making an adjustment would be to pick a face and move it. And then if I want to make a little finer adjustment, I can go to an edge And then if I want to make a little finer adjustment, then I can affect it on actually the vert level. So those are kind of the three components of a T-Splines object, and how you use those are going to determine, you know, how you add your detail and make your manipulations and things like that. But this is basically how you interact with a T-Splines object. You're going to make something, and you're going to either add or remove detail, and then you're going to kind of stretch and push and pull and sculpt it until you get something that you like. And you'll notice that the whole time it's maintaining this, you know, this wonderful kind of smooth transition from one bit and piece to another. One of the beauties of this system is the flexibility for how you manipulate things is so great that it really allows you the capability of being able to design things on the fly. And that for me is really fantastic, because instead of just trying to, you know, copy a drawing and make a CAD model, I can actually sit down and design something in 3D, which is really quite effective. So let's look at a couple of different ways that you can make stuff. I demonstrated one, which is just to start with a box. And obviously, I can pick the points, and I can move that around and modify it to do things like that. You could feasibly start with a box or a sphere or something like that and just smush points around until you're happy. That's one of the simplest ways to do this. If I wanted to add detail to it, I can select a face, and I can hold down a manipulator and Alt-drag. If I hold down the Alt key and drag a manipulator, you'll notice that it's extruding another face. I can do that again, and I can add another piece out here. I can Alt-drag this. And you can see how you can just kind of start to pull a shape out of a basic form. Now I've added detail here. If you think about the Alt key as the add geometry key, as you pick and move around here, then you can come in and start making some kind of crazy finger-looking shape sticking out of a box. Okay, I don't want to get too hung up in the shapes here, but I just want to show you that you can basically start with nothing and start just pulling something out until it starts turning into something. The other way to work would be to start with some curves. And again, if I bring up my translate manipulator up here, if I click on one of these triads and I Alt-drag out, you'll notice that I can just kind of interactively extrude a curve. And one of the beauties of this is you can start just making something by just Alt-dragging. So you can create some really awesome organic forms just off of a single extruded curve. So let's extrude a curve. I'm going to Alt-drag this 3 separate times because I want 3 separate faces. And if I go up here in face mode, you'll see I have 3 separate faces up, separate faces down. And I'm going to do the same thing up here. I'm going to go out 1, Alt-drag 2, Alt-drag 3. And I'm starting to kind of capture some form here. But I want to connect these two. And this is one of the biggest things that bugged me when I first started this is I'm like, well, how do I fill it? And how do I blend? And how do I trim? And how do I do all that kind of stuff? Well, trimming aside, because we don't trim things in T-Splines, we take shapes and blend them together. You can use the bridge command up here, and I want to make sure that my selection mode is set to edges because I want to blend this edge into this edge. And if I click here, I can change it to faces, but I want to be in edges. So I'm going to pick edges. I'm going to click my edges. And my display is freaking out here. So I'm going to click those two sets of edges. So select the edge change to bridge. I'm going to right click to accept that. And you'll notice that there's a little manipulator that shows up here. You'll see there's an arrow on this end and an arrow on this end. You want those arrows to be lined up. I don't want one arrow pointing this way and one arrow pointing that way. And you'll see that it's approximately going to go like this. I can pick how many segments to connect this surface to this surface. And in this case, I'm going to leave this set at 3 because I want it to make 3 faces in here because I want some added detail. Show preview. I can show my preview. It's giving me an approximation of how this stuff is going to come together. And I'm just going to accept the other options, right-click to accept, and you'll notice that it actually just built a little piece of geometry that blends smoothly from one end to the other. This geometry can then be manipulated like any other piece of T-Splines data, and you can just keep going. Okay. I can pick a face and Alt-drag to add some detail here. I can also go in if I wanted to add a negative space. The Fisher-Price guys who are here, you can start to see how you can put a character together fairly quickly doing this kind of workflow. Okay, so that's how you would connect two pieces of geometry. And for another example of that, let me show you a couple of cool features here. If we were starting from a primitive object, and in this case I'm going to use a torus, and primitive objects are always centered around the origin, and so it's going to set here. I'm going to interactively drag what my torus looks like, and up here you'll notice that there's some options. My vertical faces, that's how many faces are going to go around it. And then I'm going to turn symmetry on, and I want radial symmetry because I want to be able to modify this in a radial fashion. So I have 4 vertical faces, symmetry's on. I don't need an axial symmetry. I'm going to use radial instead. My symmetry segments are going to be 8, and I'm going to use 2 faces per segment so that I've got some added detail. And you can play around with those settings and see which works for you.
Kyle, just to see you kind of get into this, I just wanted to make a note that we'll definitely have time for questions at the end. And in the meantime, if anyone has any questions on the stuff that Kyle is showing, feel free to just type in the question box on the side of your screen, and we have some guys at the ready to answer any questions you have as Kyle goes along.
Great. So you'll notice what happened is it created a torus, and you'll see these green segments in here. Those are indicators of where the symmetry sections are. And that means if I select any of these edges, like this one for example, and I slide it around, you'll notice that whatever I do to that one happens in radial symmetry around the object. So you can do some really cool stuff really quickly. So let's look at doing something that kind of looks like this. And we'll add some bumps in there. And I'm not going to beat this to death too bad, but you can obviously see for awesome flexibility and creative superpowers here. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a sphere in the center, and I'm going to use kind of the same settings because I want to have pretty much the same segments that are going on with my outside piece. And I'm going to go in here and make a few modifications to this. And when I'm happy with that, I'm going to blend this surface into this surface. And again, I'm going to go back to bridge because I'm building a what? Say it with me. A bridge from one side to the other. Okay? And in this case, I'm going to use faces because I'm going to bridge from this face to this face. Now what will happen is when I bridge this, I'm going to lose my symmetry. And that's okay because I can always go back and delete the rest of the model and reapply symmetry and stuff like that. But for this case, I just want you to see how the bridge tool works. And it's going to tell me that your symmetry is lost. I'm going to accept that. And you'll notice that it makes a really fantastic transition from the inner piece to the outer piece. Any car guys in the audience, this is how you would make steering wheels. This is the TS steering wheel command. Because you basically, you build your hub, you build your wheel, and you bridge them together. And that's not terribly pretty because I wasn't very careful about how I put it together, but you can see how you can also bridge multiple faces. I pick 2 at a time. You can very quickly start to get something really organic, really beautifully blended together. If I shut off my isoparams here, you can see that those are transitions that you may be able to build in NURBS, but I doubt it. All right, so we've covered a couple of things. Making something from a box, making something from curves, and then making things from some primitive things and blending them together.